Hello, and welcome to the 53rd episode of a NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agha Bahari, a ethologist on Live in Limbo on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, and on YouTube. And also, we started to uploading different segments of the show on BitChute. So today with me, I have Chris Niebauer. Am I pronouncing your family name correctly?
It's actually Niebauer.
Niebauer. Okay. My apologies. English is not my first language. I'm doing pretty good, I believe, but every day is an opportunity to learn something new. So welcome to NEOHUMAN, Chris.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Let's start with your background, the work you've done, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Well, my training in grad school and my doctorate really centered around the left and right brain and really low-level perceptual processes. But I found myself continuously asking bigger questions, and the neuroscience stuff just it didn't really get me to where I wanted to be. And in grad school, I started reading a lot of Eastern philosophy. And fortunately, I had a mentor who was very open to that. So we would kind of do normal science Monday through Thursday, and then Friday would be sort of philosophical speculation about mind, what it means to be human. And so I kind of got that training along the way, and it really helped because I've found that kind of putting the two together, putting the Eastern philosophy and the neuroscience together has been a really powerful tool to kind of get a grip on who we are, what we're doing here, how we're going to fix it, how we're going to clean it up, those kind of problems.
You have a new book, I'm showing it to our viewers, called No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. So I know you're in academia. How is the take from your colleagues with respect to mixing Eastern philosophy and Western science? Because in many respects, it seems like in West, we figured everything out in the surface, and academia, they have capitalized on that surface understanding of everything that we know about and we're experiencing. And many academics that I came across, they're very hostile towards the Eastern philosophy and spirituality and all everything that comes from the other side of the world. How has been your experience with respect to that?
I think you got a good take on it, and there's a reason behind this, because if you look at the Buddha's discoveries, and if you follow his simple discovery of the mind, and then you follow the Zen Buddhist tradition that one could almost characterize as anti-intellectual, and then you come to the university, which is the central place where we cultivate mind, and being intelligent is the currency here at the university. And so I'm not sure the two have the same goals, and so sometimes there's a little bit of I think maybe misunderstanding, because at the university, everything is about mind, intelligence, language is such a dominant force here at the university. And yet you go into the Eastern tradition and monks may not speak at all for a long time. And that's very confusing, I think, to the average academic, because they see language as such a powerful force. And then in the East, again, there's this, I think maybe the simplest symbolism is a finger pointing to the moon isn't the moon. And in academia, we're looking at the finger, and we think the finger is really important. And so you see a lot of that, mistaking the map for the territory in academia. So I've had that challenge, I think, through all.
And it also seems like the concept of not knowing is encouraged in Eastern philosophy, but it's kind of penalized in the Western kind of culture in academia. So it's like fundamental difference.
Oh, and I think you see this playing out probably to the greatest extent in the work on consciousness. And you've got so many academics and you have so many brilliant thinking minds trying to figure out consciousness. And there's a very real possibility that the thinking mind cannot conceptualize consciousness. The thinking mind might be limited with certain things. We see the same thing with quantum mechanics and physics. So the thinking mind just falls short of understanding anything about quantum mechanics. And some of the famous quantum physicists have come right out and said that, we don't understand it at all. And I think you could apply that same thing to consciousness. The thinking mind may never understand consciousness. And academia looks at that as a huge failure. It may just be the way reality is. The thinking mind might have its limitations.
Yeah, but I guess if you're in academia, you can't say, we don't know what's going on, yet you have to pay thousands of dollars so we can teach you that.
Well, I actually start off my consciousness class with a very famous quote. I'll paraphrase it. On the topic of consciousness, nothing worth reading has ever been written about it. That's a tough way to start a class. But there's a very old tradition. If you start off, Tao Te Ching, and there's so many times in the East, they'll start off and they'll say, anything that can, the written word is not the truth, and the truth can never be captured in the written word. But by the way, I'm going to write a bunch of stuff anyway. And so we talk about it. We're talking right now using that left brain, linguistic thinking mind, and that's what we work with.
So your book is called No Self, No Problem. Before we get into a more in-depth kind of a conversation about consciousness and self and
Sure.
the purpose and meaning of it all and all of that, how would you define self?
Well, that's a good question, and that's one of those questions you could spend a lifetime contemplating. It's one of the things that's very fascinating as a professor, because I got a lot of 20-year-olds, and that's really what they're dealing with. They're wrestling with this idea, who am I? And they have to battle culture that's kind of imposing a certain self on them, and they have to realize, well, am I what culture defines me as? Is there something else there? And I hit them up with the neuroscience part of it, which seems to be pretty as conclusive as you can get, that the self is nothing but a thought of who we think we are. There's no real substance to the self. And for example, in my I would teach these large intro classes in psychology, and I would go over the split brain patients, which is one of my favorite topics, and I would focus on how the left brain makes up all kinds of explanations for how it thinks the world is working. That's what the left brain does. And one of the explanations, to try to get a feel of what's going on around us, is it creates this idea of a self. And so the self is nothing more than another hypothesis that the brain has generated.
An illusion.
There's no substance to it. It's just a thought like any other thought we might have. And so I will literally in my class say, well, the self is nothing more than a thought of the self. And I will see students write that out. I am nothing more than a thought of who I think I am. But it's not really hitting them at that deeper level. They're just looking at it as something to memorize for a test, because that's a pretty deep thing to take in. And especially in Western culture, we take a look, the self is prized, and we spend perhaps a whole lifetime cultivating the self, building the self, distinguishing the self. And that's the thing we're really desperately hoping doesn't die. And so the fear of death is maybe the central threat to the sense of self. And so we spend all this time in our culture building, defining, and then you come along and you say, look, this thing you're working on, it's just a thought of who you think you are. And I don't think it's not going to click right away. And it takes a little time. It's like you can't just go run a marathon one day. You take little steps, and that's the same thing with the self. Seeing through the illusion of self is nothing that's going to happen overnight, particularly not in our culture.
So there's so much to talk about. You mentioned left brain a number of times for myself as well, but for also those of our audience who don't know the difference. What is the difference between the left and the right brain?
Well, that's what I've been working on for about 20 plus years, trying to find what the core difference is. Because if you look, one of the most obvious facts about the brain when you're looking at it anatomically is that nature did not just create one big brain. And so if you look, there's just a clear left half and there's a clear right half. And these things even have their own blood supply. So they're really functionally separate. But at the same time, nature created this connection, this bridge called the corpus callosum. So we have two really separate brains, but they're highly interconnected. And so you have to ask, well, why? Why not just build one big brain? And it turns out that when you get into the functions of the left and right brain, they're really like yin and yang. They're really complementary to each other, because nature can't build one system that can do everything. It has to do division of labor. And so we find the left brain, what is it good at? And then we find the right brain, and we'll see that what it's good at is actually very complementary. And I'll give your viewers this kind of I was just thinking about this over lunch. I was thinking, what's an icon of the left brain and a picture of the right brain that gives the gist of both? And I think a desk. And when I think of the left brain, I think of a desk. Because the whole thing about the left brain is it's trying to organize thoughts. It's doing it almost entirely through language. When we sit at a desk, that's what we do. We read, we write. It's almost always language. And we're trying to plan for the future and try to reorganize, learn from our past. And that, I think, captures what the left brain is doing. When I think about the right brain, I think about a playground. Like, think about like kids play. Like, the right brain is so in the moment. It has no seriousness of the left brain. It's more about play. It's more about being where you're at and doing what you're doing. And we have a phrase for this we call mindfulness. And so the mindfulness movement has been really huge through even academia. I'm teaching a course. People can get course credit on a class on mindfulness now. And I think that all taps into what the right brain is all about. It's being in the moment, not thinking about who you are, trying to better yourself as a person, because you can't really do that when you're in the moment. And I guess that would be the way I would kind of look at the two. And of course, there's like thousands of research articles. I mean, we could spend all the time getting into data, but that's my kind of quick assessment of how I see the two sides of the brain. And they're two different worlds that we're always choosing to live in one or the other. And so you come to work, and and even right now, you put the left brain on, and we're able to communicate with language. And then we go off and we play to the extent that we can. And we play music. Music is a very strange thing. Why do we listen to music? We don't get any. No one gives us a check at the end of listening to music. We're not bettering ourselves. And so these are all the things about the right brain: music, art, poetry. These are things we do because we just enjoy doing them. And we're kind of losing track, I think, in our culture. We're a left brain culture, and we need to reconnect with that.
So would it be fair to say that children are more in touch with their right side brain? Because this is a concept that keeps coming up, that we actually have got it when we are children, but then we grow up through the values that are being placed on us by our family, and then education system, and then the society, and then we spend a lifetime to go back to where we began.
That's absolutely it, in my view. We start off, and if you've ever held an infant, and it's just amazing to think what must be going, the peace and tranquility that must be going through their consciousness at that moment. They have no mind, they're just pure existence. And that's not to say they don't cry sometimes, but when they're crying, and when they're happy, they're happy. Then about 2 years old, we turn on the mind, and that's all left brain. And that's when we start speaking and we start talking. And more importantly, that's when we start symbolizing the world. And so instead of dealing with the real world, we start creating our images of the real world, and that's all left brain. And we spend a lifetime doing that. And if we're lucky, at some point, maybe midway or maybe towards the end, we start connecting with where we started from. And Picasso, and there's artists will tell us, that's what they did. They cultivated the left brain. They had a process, and then they learned to paint like a kid again, and that's where they found their talents. And so that's what we need. That would be a great cultural message for us. We need to kind of reconnect with that, 12-month-old, because the great thing about a 12-month-old is they're so in the present moment. Every moment, and then there's no self. And we know this from, I don't know if you're familiar with the mirror test. There's a test you can test for self-awareness where you just put a kid in front of a mirror. And I got a wonderful video of my son failing it at 12 months. And he would look in the mirror, and he was sure that was another kid to play with. So he didn't recognize himself, and he'd look behind the mirror trying to find that kid. And he was just bewildered. He's like, where'd that kid go? And he did this for almost about a half an hour. And then about 2, something clicks in, and that's the self that kicks in. We look in the mirror and we say, oh, that's me. And then we've got this like picking up a bunch of luggage, and then we're going to carry this stuff around a whole lifetime. And if we're lucky, when we get a certain age, we realize that's just something that we learned. And if we've learned it, we can unlearn it. And we put it back down, and then we kind of connect again with that inner child. And then I think things can work out actually quite well.
Yeah, I was talking about similar kind of a concept. I have a Monday to Thursday live stream called Beyond Good and Evil. And one of the concepts I talk about was involuntary baggage, that we are being given certain things, again, by our family, by our school system, by our society and culture, all the values that, for example, I was born in Iran, I was 1 second old, I was branded as a Shia Muslim straight male Iranian.
Yeah.
And, good luck getting away from any of them.
I'm talking about baggage. You just had a bunch of baggage just dumped on you.
Yeah.
And what do you make of that? I mean, what do you do with that? And
Well, it just seems like those societies, they give more value to group thinking and tribalism and one for all rather than individuals finding their own capability. And it really is such a deep kind of a concept because religions also have capitalized on that from my perspective, that enlightenment or the concept of Christ consciousness, these are the things that are revealed on a personal basis, not that you believe in something outside of yourself and you're going to be fine when you die, right? But it's a very powerful tool to influence people.
well, you just hit on one of the main functions of the left brain, categorization. And when we talk about categorization, we're talking about labeling people, and you're either in this group or you're in some other group. And the left brain does this, and it's very difficult for the left brain to conceptualize that these categories are just constructs, that they're not real. And so people think you really are this or you really are that, and they don't get that this is just a finger pointing to the moon kind of thing. It's just it's a mental construct. That's all categories are. And so at the end of my book, I have an exercise really to help people get around categories. And this is a very common thing people do when they do guided meditations. And so you get to a point where you're feeling a pretty decent meditation, and then you ask, what would you be if you're not your gender? What would you be if you're not your race? What would you be if you're not your religion? And one by one, people tear these layers of culture, being culture taught by their culture, and they tear those apart, and eventually they're left with what's in the middle.
What is in the middle?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a great left brain question, because that's the left brain wants answers, and because the left brain is always creating hypotheses to explain the world, it always comes up with concrete, I know this to be true kind of answers. And what I found, at least in my own exploration and my workings with Zen and even neuroscience, is that when we get to the core and say, well, who am I? We very well may have to live with a mystery. And mysteries, as far as the right brain is concerned, mysteries are tolerable. Not even tolerable. The right brain may even crave a mystery and may love the unknown and may love the fact that there's no definitive answer.
What do you think will happen if we scientifically can get rid of the left side of the brain and expand the right side to include all of the functionality of our brain? What kind of a society will be? Because you mentioned race and gender and all of that, and the contrast to that is what is happening in our societies right now, that people are capitalizing only on race or only on gender.
Well, actually, it's not just me. There's another researcher out there, Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a wonderful book, The Master and His Emissary. And his main hypothesis is that our culture is deeply possessed by the left brain and its processing. And so that's one of the consequences. A culture possessed by the left brain is going to want to categorize everyone. And these categories like race and gender, which again, you see these so popular on campuses in particular, and that is a reflection of left brain processing. So if we could, in a way, kind of turn down the left brain a little, and there are definitely some ways we can do this. And like you said, it's a great, speculation. What would a right brain culture look like? It would look really different than the one we live in. Imagine just right off the top, imagine processing people individually. And so every person you meet, instead of categorizing them as male and all the things that you got thrown on you very early, what if we just met a person and thought for a moment, they're a mystery. And I don't really know them. And when you start off a relationship like that, it keeps all the possibilities open. See, categories, the problem with them is they close possibilities down, and that's the function of the left brain, because if you're going to make some kind of decision or guess about the world, you have to close all the infinite possibilities down and decide on one thing. That's why the left brain so often thinks it's right about things. You get this kind of sense, and especially in our culture, that we just assume this or that is right. And sorry about that. And the left and the right brain is the exact, like I said, yin to yang, and the right brain is always, well, maybe I'm wrong, and so I don't know you, and the right brain we could live in a culture where we lived with that possible mystery, where maybe we're wrong about things,
And it's also that maybe we're wrong and it's okay, not that maybe we're wrong and it's terrible.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's a great point. See, the left brain, if it ever even admits that it's wrong, then that's a defeat.
Right.
And that gets tied in with the self, and that's why we feel horrible. We're like, oh, if you've ever been really wrong about something because someone just threw something in your face and the evidence is overwhelming, you feel self-defeated and you feel really bad. The right brain has none of that. The right brain can look at every wrong as an opportunity, and it's okay to be wrong.
Could it be the difference between having a goal and objective and not having a goal and objective? Because without a goal and objective, all of these definitions will become moot completely. That you don't have to define right and wrong, good and bad. You're just going with the flow. You're living your life in the present, unless you're moving towards something that every step of the way you define whether or not you're getting closer or further from that goal and ultimate objective.
Yeah. Well, there's a great phrase in Zen, right and wrong are the sickness of the mind. And so you see that with the left brain. It's right and wrong. And you see that tied in with, like, okay, what are my goals? And so I so often see students where they're living just to get their degree. And when they get their degree, then they're going to live to get married or some level of success. And that's the problem with the left brain. I should mention a couple things about the left brain, that these are good qualities in terms of evolution. They probably got us out of a lot of messes 40,000 years ago. And, when we looked at kind of the environment that we had to deal with, we had to be kind of paranoid and we had to plan for the future. The problem is we just don't need this right now. We've literally got more than we need in terms of, the basics to live. And so, you're probably familiar with Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now. And I think that hit our culture in a very interesting way, because it was a wake up to the moment, and if you keep planning for the future, their whole life can go by and then you weren't even there to enjoy it. And it's the wonderful thing about getting the right brain going, that kind of present moment awareness, and just be there for a little bit. So you actually were there for your existence.
Chris's new book is called No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. You mentioned the mirror test, and my understanding is that humans and chimps are the only species who can recognize themselves in a mirror. Is that true?
The list keeps getting longer. And so dolphins seem to have passed the test, elephants have passed the test, actually even some birds like magpies, which have very tiny brains. And this is kind of a mystery, because we're kind of, in neuroscience, we're so connected to this idea that brain creates consciousness, that brain creates who we are. And so if you, like before, you're saying, well, who are we? Well, as far as neuroscience is concerned, you are that 3 pounds of gelatinous goo in your skull. I mean, that's the beginning and end to neuroscience. And so that's a mystery. We can't figure this out, because you think, well, the self is a very complex thing and we prize it so much, but then you have this bird brain literally passing the mirror test. And so people don't really know what to make of that.
You talked about Zen. I've been influenced by Zen a lot, starting with Alan Watts. And then I came across a traveling, even though he was not calling himself a Zen monk anymore, but this was an old Japanese man I came across in Toronto. And he got kicked out of a Zen monastery when he was in his teen in Japan, because he experimented with psilocybin mushroom. And he told me that what was revealed to him and what he experienced was so mind-blowing that he couldn't keep it to himself. So he ran and told his Roshi, his master, and he got kicked out of the monastery because they're like, you're taking the easy way out, basically. You're cheating. Do you see any kind of reasoning for the kind of stigma that has been built around psychedelics, mainly because it empowers the right side of the brain in the society that is inherently built upon the left side dominance?
That's a great question because one of the most interesting responses came when a bunch of monks started, or a bunch of neuroscientists and a bunch of monks started to get together because they realized there's a deep connection between what neuroscience was finding and what Buddhism had held for so many years. And it came down to a discussion between the Dalai Lama and a bunch of neuroscientists. And one neuroscientist put it just like this. He asked the Dalai Lama if he could just take a pill and get the same effects from meditation, would he do it? And Dalai Lama, he didn't even think about it. He's like, yeah, give me the pill. And I think that kind of was startling to people because they kind of feel exactly as you put it, like you're cheating somehow. And the only thing I can come up with is I think that's a left brain response. It's the left brain, like if you can somehow cheat the left brain out of its dominance, it's going to somehow defend itself. And it's going to say, no, you can't, don't take these drugs. You're getting there the easy way. And it's funny because in our culture, I would put it this way. I'd say because of the left brain dominance, we have a terrible thinking problem on our hands. And what we're doing is we're trying to think our way out of a thinking problem. And that just isn't working. So there are other methods to do this. And there are drugs that people ingest, and all of a sudden the mind turns off. And like Ram Dass, when he describes his experience. And all of a sudden the self, it's like an immediate deconstruction of the self. And it's a permanent life changer. And so, but the left brain, when it kicks in, it's going to say, oh, you cheated. You can't get there from here. That's not fair. And, but there it is. I mean, you clearly have the mystics who have done meditation, and there's certainly the various drugs that have been ingested that have seen through the illusion of self. And if you get there, you get there. And so I'm not going to critique that or have a judgment on it.
Terence McKenna had a joke. I actually heard it on Joe Rogan that Buddha comes to a town and a monk tells him, I've been practicing levitation across the river for 10 years. And Buddha looked at him and was like, but the ferry is just a nickel.
Yeah. I mean, we want to work for things. I mean, that's the thing about the left brain. When you put these goals, and the left brain always wants to have like some kind of calendar. We're going to say, well, this is how hard I'm going to work today, and this is how hard I'm going to work tomorrow. And there's a kind of an effortlessness with the right brain. And that's the whole Zen trip, in my opinion. They have this ability to get through life without trying. And they're not putting effort into anything. And the left brain looks at that and goes, I just don't get it. It doesn't make to work for things. And yeah, interesting.
Are you familiar with the concept of or theory of Stoned Ape?
Oh yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from my memory, which I actually did just catch this not that long ago, the idea is that we had certain mushrooms available in our history. So we're going back 40,000 years perhaps. And with the ingestion of these various mushrooms, certain characteristics of bravery but at the same time kindness came along, and that would make for a great leader. And I mean, it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure how testable it is, because when we get back that far, it gets really difficult. But I think these are characteristics of the right brain, and that's the interesting thing about fearlessness and courage. They're very difficult to do when you've got a serious self dragging along, because you're always worried about the self. And that's the thing about the warrior or the hero. They can they put the self aside, and it's not about them anymore. I was just telling the story about the Grail myth and the wounded Grail King, and that's the message of that. To whom does the Grail serve? And we realize it's not a selfish thing anymore. It's about community. And all of a sudden, the Grail King's wounds healed from that. And I think that's a message that these kind of factors, which again all align with the right brain, might make for a really a very good leader, the kind of the leader that we need in our culture. I think we could really use right brain leaders that have seen through the nature of the self, and their function isn't really a selfish one, and their function is more community based. And that's where we get kind of into the non-dualism stuff. But yeah.
Do you think a right brain kind of a person will see the necessity to lead at all? to become a
No,
leader?
no, I don't think they would. And that's what would make them a good leader.
Right.
I, I think the idea of wanting to lead is too tied in with left brain ego, and that's going to mess things up, I think. And I think the best leaders are the ones that don't want to lead at all.
Mm.
So,
There's a movie called Johnny Got His Gun. I don't know if you've seen it. Most people have seen excerpts in Metallica's One music video. It's about a soldier who went to World War I, a young man. He lost his limbs, his arms and legs. He can't hear, he can't see. It's a black and white movie, and you see him on the bed of a hospital with a cone on his face. And his narration is the voice inside his head. And I always think of this movie and use it as an example as to find out who we are, who this self is, because you get rid of the arms. We always say my arms, my legs, my heart, my stomach. Who is that my? And it seems like it's such an unknown and such an inherently unknown thing at the core of existence that we've taken intentional detour towards focusing on the left brain, because those are the things that we can quantify. Those are the things that we can make sense out of. But it seems like that disconnect is finally catching up with us.
well, yeah, I think one of the major advances we'll have is in terms of what we're identifying as self. And I think the idea of identifying with a body is one of the major things that we need to deal with. And once you realize, you're not this meat suit, and this is just like, something I'm kind of occupying for the time being, and whatever my essence of self is, this isn't it. And that's, to me, that's the beginning. And when you see that, then you're off to a good start. And the problem, of course, is like, again, because no particular part is necessary, and no particular thought is necessary for the self. And I think that's actually what the Buddha was getting at when he was talking about his lecture on no self. He's like, look, reality is in a continuous state of flux and change, and it's moving. So how could there be this solid, continuous sense of self behind all that, when the nature of reality is exactly the opposite? And so this body is gonna, it's very temporary. It's just gonna, like, a flash of light. It's gonna be here and it'll be gone. That can't be me,
And it's also the subjectivity of self too, right? It's like when you're in a conversation with someone else in a room, there are three different versions of you exist. Each of you exists. One that you think who you are, one that the other person think who you are, and one that who you really are.
And the one that you think the other person thinks you are. And that's how we get in so many deep levels. Well, I mean, left brain is very clever in its depth and its ability to think about thinking. And so, and then even if you conceptualize that self as a thought, it still gets very deep into this, like, well, who am I? Well, am I who I think I am? Am I really an introvert? And then you think, well, maybe I just think other people think I'm an introvert, and that's why I think I'm an introvert. And then you realize these are all just thoughts. And if thoughts are just things that come and go, like, a leaf falling kind of thing, then maybe who's to take them so seriously?
Do you think this reality that we're experiencing is a result of this device that is our brain working like a computer, making sense out of the information that exists, in a way that everything and everybody in this world has their own version of experiences, but the more powerful the computer is, the processor is, more you can make sense out of it? Is that something that is a sensible kind of a statement?
Are you suggesting the idea that like this is a simulation kind of thing, or?
Well, that's one way to look at it, but let's think about it in the context of artificial intelligence, for example, that we are making the argument that maybe we can model the human brain, but we can never model consciousness.
Oh yes, actually, yes, exactly. So I also teach a class on artificial intelligence, and the idea that we're creating artificial minds, I think there's no doubt that we've already done this. I mean, when talking about the mind, as the way I've discussed it, it's this thinking machine, and it solves problems, and my phone solves all kinds of problems, and it figures out all kinds of puzzles. So we already have an artificial mind. But that mistake that I was getting back to that's so common is to confuse mind with consciousness. And so the computers are doing an outstanding job replicating mind. But in my opinion, that says nothing about consciousness.
How would you define consciousness? Because a lot of people use this term the same way they use the term God. They don't really understand it. Nobody understands it. And this is just putting labels on the unknown. And it seems to me that all of them could be the same thing. We're just calling it with different names.
And we get back to, okay, well, what's the self? And I was satisfied with leaving it as a mystery. And I think the same holds true for consciousness. And so when we put the whole thing together, we see that consciousness is vast enough. It can hold the thinking mind without a problem. It can channel through the thinking mind. And that's the normal person. But when we reverse it and we say, can the thinking mind hold consciousness? And it can't. And so that's why the thinking mind is such a mystery, and it just can't. And so I don't think the thinking mind has the capacity to understand in a way that we understand other things, and it can't apply this to consciousness. And so in that sense, it has to remain a mystery. But that's only to the thinking mind. And so, when you get into some pretty good meditative states, and you empty consciousness of all content, and then you ask, and then there comes this feeling like, well, why do I need to understand anything? And so I don't think consciousness will be understood, but I also think that's okay.
So would you say that consciousness is something that exists without us and we're just making sense out of it based on our own experience, or is this consciousness is a result and outcome of our own experience based on our brain capacity?
My favorite metaphor for all this, I like the fountain outside of Bellagio, the hotel in Las Vegas. And when you see these fountains, it's really cool because you see these shooting, little isolated spots of water, and then they go back to kind of the eternal consciousness. And so I think, the question of the one and many is a very difficult one. But to me, that's an image that captures the best I can do in understanding how the process is happening. So we stem from this eternal consciousness, and just for a real brief moment, it feels like we're separate. But once that separate water gets back into the one, it's indistinguishable. It immediately connects and becomes part of the whole big picture again. And for my take, that's what's going to happen. And that's what's happening right now. So I get this little trip of being this unique individual consciousness, but then it's just going to go back into the collective.
Yeah, since we talked about psychedelics, I think it's interesting to mention it in this context. 5-MeO-DMT, Bufo, that, are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not.
So it's a poison of one kind of species out of 7,000 plus amphibian species. And this is a Bufo alvarius who lives in Sonoran Desert and comes above the ground only 2 months in a year. And its clue is rain hitting the ground. It's only on the ground for 2 months, and it produces these poison in its glands that can be milked, dried up, and smoked. And it's the most intense psychedelic experience on this planet. And what you're explaining about consciousness as a surface that we just, as drops, we just come out of it and go back to it, that's the closest that I could experience it firsthand after smoking a certain amount of that, because you're gone. You do not have a body. Your environment do not exist. And you go to this environment that is so alien, yet safe, if that makes sense. It's very strange kind of an experience. It takes from the moment that you smoke it to come back to normal, maybe 25 minutes. And, it made me think a lot that where is this place? Is this where we're going after we die? And then I did some research about quantum fluctuations, that the empty space is not really empty, and perhaps that's what's... So it's really interesting because this whole thing was extracted for the first time in the 50s. So it's not something that our ancestors have been doing it. And to have this experience in this kind of a society and in this kind of a reality, which, as you said, is very left brain dominated. And I'm not encouraging people to go and do that. I'm just saying that there are very real ways, because I've also heard that if you do certain kind of yoga, you can get to that state of mind experiencing it. There are very real pathways to experience that unity, which is something that, exactly like you said, don't need to be understood. It just needs to be experienced. And once you experience it, there is no going back. You cannot unknow it.
It sounds kind of, when you were describing that, it sounds like various descriptions of the DMT trip. And
it is a DMT. It's a natural DMT. So the synthetic DMT is NN-DMT. Okay. This is 5-MeO-DMT. Only this one toad produces it in its glands out of 7,000 plus amphibians. And the only difference between, I would say, 5-MeO and NN-DMT is that it does not have as strong of a visuals of NN-DMT, which is synthetic extract DMT. But yeah, you're gone. You're in a place, you're in a room, but you're gone. And I've been around a lot of people who've done it, who start screaming, start acting in a very strange kind of a way, and when they come out of it, they don't remember any of it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we can be a left brain dominated culture, but we're still confronted with mystery after mystery. So we've got near-death experiences, and we've got very detailed accounts like Evan Alexander, and I mean, his brain is just melting away, and yet his consciousness is in a world that's way more real than how he would describe this reality. And then we've got these parallel worlds that people seem to go to under various drugs, and we've got all kinds of anomalous conscious experiences, out-of-body experiences, and to me that's quite fascinating, because what it does is it throws us into a mystery of not really knowing. There's just enough evidence that we say maybe, but it's not so conclusive that we can know with any certainty. And that, I think, is maybe the meaning of all this.
Absolutely.
And have a little fun with this trip, because it's a wild ride, and it ultimately is a mystery. No matter how much the brain thinks it knows everything and can predict the future, it really doesn't.
Yeah, I think Alan Watts also explained it really beautifully, that when you listen to music, it's not like you're looking forward to the last hit of the song or last beat of the song. You just enjoy throughout, you dance with it until it's over.
Yeah. No, that's a great right brain. That's why I said, it's a playground, And Alan Watts has that wonderful story about, what would God do? What would an all-powerful being do? All-knowing, all-powerful. It's very likely it could just kind of get bored, kind of be a drag. It would just kind of be like, okay, and so maybe to entertain itself, it would lose itself. And in losing itself, that's what we are. We're just kind of like, all these kind of dreams, of the eternal that's happening all at once. And it's a wild, I once said that God is an experience junkie. And the way God is fulfilling all these wild experiences is through each one of us. And so each one of us is having a really interesting ride and giving God a unique view of how could God worry about death unless it was through us? And when we worry about death, we're giving a very unique experience to the universe, something that it couldn't happen without us. And so I think Alan Watts put it something like that the most square people are really having the very best ride in this game. The people who take work terribly seriously, and the people who are very, very, particular. There is, the rule book in life is very thick, and so they're giving the universe a very interesting ride.
So that's actually what you talked about, consciousness. Your definition of consciousness is what I was talking about, whether or not everything in this world experiences consciousness according to our processing capability of making sense out of it. The other way I can explain it, the way I understand it, is that consciousness is like internet, and each of us are like computers, that you get connected to internet, but if the computer is gone, it doesn't mean that internet is gone. Internet exists. It just, our link to it has been vanished.
That's a popular view now in consciousness research that the brain, and it goes back. Some of the early physicists had this idea, and certainly the mystics, that the brain is more of a receiver, and it's just channeling in. In fact, it may not even be channeling in consciousness as much as it's filtering out a lot of the kind of totality of what consciousness could experience. And I like that view. And certainly, I mean, there's certainly a connection between brain and consciousness in the sense that you affect brain, you affect consciousness. And so we can't overlook there's some connection there. But, then the counter to that has been, well, how do I even know I have a brain? This is just something people have told me. I've never seen my brain. It's as much a hypothetical as anything else.
X-ray maybe? No?
I mean, but then you say, well, I've had MRIs, but even that, you just
Right.
don't get to see the stuff, and it's still considered a hypothetical.
Right.
I'm just giving you one opinion that came up, but it just always leads us back to that mystery. And neuroscience, because it started off as a left brain endeavor, it was so certain it was going to figure things out with the brain, and the 90s were considered the decade of the brain. So we started this adventure a long time ago, and we've got the brain mapped out very well, and people know the different functions of different parts of the brain, but it hasn't yielded one bit of insight into the nature of consciousness yet. And I think that, though, is kind of telling. What does it say if decades of brain research haven't told us really, and we don't even have a good theory of actual consciousness, or even a bad theory right now, let alone a good theory. And so maybe it's just, people keep waiting for that, maybe it's just around the corner. Someone's going to come up with some breakthrough discovery about how 3 pounds of matter gives rise to awareness. That's not my bet. My bet is not. I'm going to hold out that it's going to be an eternal mystery, and that the nature of reality is, even with the physics and the quantum mechanics, the ultimate nature of reality will be something that the mind, as we experience it in this existence, it's just not going to get it. And that's not disappointing to me. I think that's actually quite exciting.
So the title of your book is How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism, and as you mentioned, neuroscience has been left brain heavy. Are you suggesting that neuroscience is moving more and more towards right brain? And also, what right brain people can learn from left brain dominated individuals and cultures to add something to this experience?
Well, I think the left brain has sort of played itself out. And you see these scientists, and they're very serious types, and then they've kind of given its due, and they've kind of pushed the thinking mind as far as it will go, and it's just not yielding anything. So I think they're kind of like, well, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's another way around this. And that's why I think the neuroscience and the Buddhism are so well connected, because they're realizing that, okay, just because something is a mystery, just because something is what we could call it a mystical experience, that doesn't invalidate it. Like, these mystical experiences are just as valid, and so they're worthy of being explored and taken as something that we should consider. And it's interesting too. You ask about what can a right brain learn about the left brain, and that's I was just talking to someone who they were describing how they get into left brain conversations, and as I mentioned, the left brain always finds a problem. That's its job. It tries to find a problem, and it wants something better. It wants the next best thing, and so that's why we complain all the time. And so if you watch humans, we're very interesting. We get in these little groups and we start complaining, and again we have this wonderful thing where who had the worst day, and it's this contest where someone wins, and then you're like, well, I had the worst day. And then did you really win by having the worst day? It's a strange thing, but in their mind they won because they had the best complaint. And so you watch people complain, and that's of course all left brain. So the right brain can really, I think, can get a really wonderful view of the mechanics of the left brain by watching it do what it does best. So you get in these complaint sessions and you just kind of sit back and watch, and you just, so this is the left brain. Not happy with it, and again, Steven Pinker, I just showed this in class the other day. Steven Pinker has shown that we live in the absolute best time. You know, we in terms of like, if you could live at any point in human history, you'd really want to live now. And so we have it really good, and there's so much to be thankful for, and so much to have gratitude for. And yet the left brain just ignores all that. It's like there's this beautiful existence just waiting to be noticed, but the left brain would rather complain about a parking space someone stole. And so, so it becomes kind of a fascinating adventure to watch people engage in these left brain activities, because at least in my experience, you just think, I can't believe I fell for it. Like, well, you know, when I was horribly neurotic in my 20s, and I had fallen for it. I fell for every trick the left brain had. Anxious at every moment, terrified of death, and it's interesting to kind of have this adventure and kind of like now look back and go, oh, I remember you. I remember that I remember you taking everything seriously, and I remember you finding fault in everything. And so kind of reminds me almost like an exhibit, like you go to like a museum and you see these dinosaur bones, and you're kind of in awe about it, because you're like, and then you see someone complaining, and it's like, oh, that's that 40,000-year-old program that got us out of that mess 40,000 years ago, but it's still running in people's heads. Fault, you know, wanting something that's different than what you have, that insatiable need for more, all that got us out of a big mess 40,000 years ago, but we just don't need it any longer. It's a program that's never been updated. You know, it's kind of a strange thing to think you've got a, 40,000-year-old program that just, I call it mind version 1.0. As it's that old and no one has ever updated it. And so it's still running. And our culture, rather than sit back and observe it, we've embraced it. And I think that's, when I said that we have a serious thinking problem on our hands, that's what I'm getting at. It's that mind 1.0 that goes off and has this belief that it's going to think its way out of a thinking problem. And I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, and this victimhood Olympics that is happening in the mainstream of our cultures, that is, as you said, it's further and further left brain focused. Do you think this is happening because of the uncertainty, which is in the nature of everything that is happening now more and more because of free internet and just decentralized ways of interpretation and distribution of information using social media, rather than 25, 30 years ago when people who had relied on left brain could make some kind of an identity as a whole, that, oh, this is what life means, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. But now anybody, you have a cell phone, you have the ability to just express yourself. Do you think, is that why that we are giving more value to victimhood?
Oh, I think what the internet and I think what social media potentially can do is like giving steroids to the left brain. It immediately cranks it up, because when we take a look, one of the things the left brain engages in, it's one of these basic processes, is confirmation bias. And the problem is that, even 50 years ago, people were somewhat limited. Well, I can go out and I can try to confirm my hypotheses, but the internet has allowed us this vast network of all kinds of ways that we can absolutely become certain. And that left brain loves the certainty it can find in the internet. And so the left brain becomes not just fairly certain, it becomes absolutely certain that this is true or that is true. And again, if we cultivate that victimhood culture, which is exactly what the left brain wants to do, poor me, So again, people say, well, why'd you call your book No Self, No Problem? Well, because as soon as you do away with the self, you do away with all your problems. And the exact opposite happens with victimhood culture. Why me? Well, all that's doing is cranking up the sense of self. And it's saying, and all these false comparisons. Oh, I could have this and I could have that. And it's so easy to get online and see people who have Ferraris and, $10 million homes, and all of a sudden the self feels, oh, that could be me. And we never decide, we never look the other way. We never look at all the things that we have and all the things that we could be grateful for. And it's turning out gratitude. It turns out to be very likely a right hemisphere function. And so we've got that kind of, yin and yang again, where we see the left brain complaining because it doesn't have everything. And the right brain is satisfied with all that it has, which is most of the time more than it needs.
Chris's book is called No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. What's next for you, Chris, and how can people follow your work? I've placed your Twitter handle, Worried Buddha, on the screen for our viewers to see. There's a question there too, that if you're a Buddha, why are you worried?
Well, because that's us. We all have good in nature, but at the same time, we're playing this game of mind.
Right.
I mean, I sound like I'm kind of coming down hard on the left brain, but in the end, it's the eternal consciousness that decided to play this game that we're playing. So if we're worried, it's because eternal consciousness is having a little fun with being worried, you know. But I've got a web page up, just chrisniebauerphd.com. And I've got a Facebook page, which is actually catching up with the Buddha, and I do a lot of my work on that. And I do a YouTube channel where I do these little videos, and it's just Chris Niebauer, PhD, and 2-minute videos, just nature of self, consciousness, and all that.
Excellent. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. I enjoyed it tremendously. And let me ask you the last question that I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Wow. Okay. I might almost say the same thing. I'd say our worst thing we have done is cultivated a mind. And at the same time, the best thing we have done is cultivated a mind, because it's allowed us the opportunity to see beyond it. And so, and it would be very interesting to see what the aliens have in store in terms of, when we talk about mind, has their minds developed the same way ours has evolution fine-tuned their mind with the same biases? And it's not that difficult. Maybe they have a completely different, the mind just assumes that it's the only form it could take. Maybe there's 1,000 different versions the mind could take. So yeah, I don't know. I'm looking forward to that moment, though.